Okay, so we are having class. It is Tuesday, and hopefully you had a nice weekend and you submitted all the stuff you need to submit. So let's talk about a couple things. Let's talk about thing number one. Thing number one always seems to be grades, so we might as well talk about that, right? So thing number one, grades. Why does it take me so long to grade stuff? Because there's a bunch of you and you all turn in stuff at the same time. So you had stuff due on Friday. Most of you turned in most of the stuff on Friday. Each student turns in 4 things. I have nearly 100 students. I mean, I have 90 something, I can't remember. So that's nearly 400 things to grade. Between 350 and 400 things to grade. It just takes a while. So sorry. I should finish your classes question 1 tonight, and I'll start working on question 2 tomorrow. Who knows, maybe by the end of the weekend, we'll get them done. Now, I had an anonymous question sometime today because it just came in through Blackboard, but it didn't identify who sent it. Can I redo the quizzes? I got to go with no on that because you've already seen the questions. So you redoing the quizzes is probably not a good idea, and I'll try to remember to share that thought with the other classes as well, because I don't even know which class it came from, although I'll have to look more closely and see if I can figure out how to figure that out. Can I turn stuff in late? Yes, you can turn stuff in late. How many points am I going to take off? I don't know. Kind of depends on a couple things. How late is it? And how good is it? So if you turn in really bad work 5 days late, I wouldn't expect very many points. If you turn in really good work 1 day late, I would expect to get most of the points. So I know that that's a fairly subjective answer, but that's kind of the truth. So if it's late, make sure it's good and try not to make it too late. Also make sure that if you're behind on stuff, that as much as you can, you let me know. I did have somebody not your class email me and say, like, I've been in hospital for 5 days. Sorry, I've been out of touch. Hey, if you've been in the hospital for 5 days, I'm not really the person you should be talking to. So that's okay. I get it. But, you know, if you are late because you were at the football game, although your football games are probably canceled, aren't they? Or the band competition. Surely, are any of those things going on? You know, if it's something you knew was going to happen, that might just be poor planning. But let me know, and if you're not in any sort of danger or emergency, let me know as soon as you can. And if you're in a danger or emergency, once that's passed and you've taken care of all the other stuff, let me know, okay? Then we'll get caught up. Also, can I have extra time for this? Can I do extra that? Can I do extra this? College class. So here are the things. Whatever I offer for you, I have to offer for every single person. We all have to have the same rules. So, you know, a couple of late assignments, that's okay. We probably don't even have to talk about that. Once it gets beyond a couple, you know, we probably have to have a talk and figure out where you're at. But you also need to kind of figure out where you're at by Thursday. I think Thursday is the last day to drop classes if it doesn't look like there's hope of passing. And I had a whole bunch more, how do I figure out my grade questions? And I'm not trying to trick any of you, but apparently this is puzzling. So by the end of the class, there's 300 points available. Actually, there's 330, but we're pretending there's 300. You need 270 to get an A, plus the book review. You need 240 to get a B, and you need 210 to get a C. So subtract what you currently have. Once I finish grading, I know it'd be nice if I were done by Thursday, but I'll try. From what point total you want, and that'll tell you what you need on the last assignment. There's 70 points available on the weekly questions plus the quiz. So if you need 110 to pass at that point, things are probably not going to go well for you. If you need 50 to pass, you're in good shape. So, you know, it kind of depends. So just look at the point total, the points available, and maybe work through it that way. I don't think there's anything else I need to tell you that's really important or crucial. It's third class of the day. I know you've had more, but I feel like I've said the same thing many times today. So turn in your stuff. We probably, book review due on the 30th, which is a Monday, the Monday after Thanksgiving. So my thought is you'll work on it during Thanksgiving. We don't have class next week, but we do have class on Thursday. Please, please, please come to class on Thursday, especially you guys, because you have missed, not your fault, of course, 2 or 3 classes because of the way your school is scheduled, and we're not having class next week because of the way your school is scheduled. And then some of you just occasionally miss a class anyway for other reasons. So come to class, okay? Come to class on Thursday because we're going over the weekly question on Thursday, not so much today because the weekly question is about Ronald Reagan. Sorry, my neck hurts. Okay. Do you guys have any questions you want to ask before we talk about the weekly questions? Is there anything you want to ask? Okay. Weekly questions. Oh, that's not the weekly question. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Weekly question. All right. So we have 3 weekly questions, which means we have 3 chapters left. You may have noticed already that I put these in on the assignments and wrote a suggested date to turn these in. These are all technically still due on December 11th, but if you turn them in earlier, you'll get feedback earlier, you'll get your grade sooner, and it'll tell you kind of how you're doing. Plus, it gives me a better chance to grade so that I'm not grading the entire weekend and not sleeping that very last weekend of class. So turning stuff in earlier would be much appreciated. You'll get better feedback. Somebody in the last class said, can we have extra credits? Like, no, because I've already given you 30 more points that are technically available in the class, and I'm not supposed to give you any. So I've already given you enough points to give you an entire grade point. So not really extra credit, but I'll be happier with you, which will probably make me, happier when I'm grading. So some teachers drink wine while they grade. I just need a little extra time. And Coke Zero, that's all I need. All right, your 3 questions. And I think the suggested due date, I know because I made them. Suggested due date or submission dates for this first one next Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday. I know it's a holiday weekend. You certainly don't have to turn it in then. But I'm just saying, you could turn it in this Friday. It'd be fine. The George Bush question the week after, and then the Barack Obama question the final Friday of class. But the question, analyze the successes of Reagan's administration, domestic and foreign policy. Domestic is stuff you do in the country. Foreign policy is stuff you do outside the country, and explain why he's popular even though we're broke when he leaves, enormous national debt. However, now we would be thrilled to have the national debt we had back then. George W. Bush commented this question 2, 2001 inaugural address, that's when you're coming in, that America had gone out into the world to protect, not to possess, and to defend, not to conquer. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Give examples. And then the last question, compare Obama and Trump's presidential campaigns. And I really meant Trump round 1, but since we've seen Trump round 2, you can talk about that one as well. The book won't, of course. Describe similarities and differences. In all 3 of these questions, your key to getting all the points you want will be specific examples with specific details, like names of events, people involved in the events, descriptions of the events, when the events happen. So details, okay? That gives me a clue that you have a better idea, better understanding of what's going on. And it also suggests that you looked in your textbook, which is really what I'm hoping for. I've noticed, I haven't finished grading the chapter 23 questions. Was World War II a good war? It's called The Good War. Do you agree with that characterization? Why or why not? Something along those lines. a lot of those answers have been really general. You know, we defeated Nazism, and then I had a whole bunch of people defining fascism. It's like, it's a US history class. I mean, you can still define fascism, but, and I told you this before you answered the question, I'm really looking for things within the United States. It is a US history class. So I was expecting, of course, that you talk about how the economy improved, or how we have a unified cause with other countries, which really was different than World War I in some ways. And of course, that you might want to discuss things that didn't go quite as well during World War II that were really related to the United States, like discrimination within the military, Japanese internment, and then the always controversial use of nuclear weapons. And lots of you didn't discuss any of those things. So be specific. And then probably the Thursday before the questions are due, or in the case of question number 1 this Thursday, maybe we'll make suggestions about really specific things to put in there. This is also why you shouldn't just log on and then go away and work on your pre-cal and not pay any attention to class, because a lot of times during class, I'm telling you exactly what I want to see in those questions. And then when I grade your question and I don't see those things, I think, oh, I wonder if they're paying attention in class, or if they're doing their pre-cal while I'm talking to them about history. These are the things I wonder. All right, so put your pre-cal up, or English, or physics, or whatever else it is you're doing, practicing the trombone, I don't know what you're doing. And make sure you're paying attention. Okay. So that was weekly questions, and they should be in the Turn It In spot, the assignment page, and the course documents page. All right. Any questions or comments to this point? I know we haven't done very much yet, but I thought I would ask. All right, then. Let's look at the notes. All right, and I think these are in the course documents section. I know somebody in an earlier class was concerned that I hadn't posted these yet, but I think all of these were posted when the class began. So I think you just got to scroll down and you will find these in the course documents section, although we probably don't need to be there. We probably need to be here. Okay, and you'll notice kind of the shortest section of notes. There's only 5 pages, but only 3 chapters, so page and a half, 2 pages per chapter. All right. Chapter 26 is really about the rise of conservatism, and it starts with Vietnam conflict under Nixon, and then goes Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. So you've got, yeah, the years that it suggests. And all of these presidents are conservative to a varying degree. Of course, you probably know, I assume you know, that Carter was a Democrat, but the rest of them were Republicans. Did you know that? Okay, this is where you're supposed to answer. Did you know that Carter was a Democrat, but the rest of those guys were Republicans?
Yes.
Thank you. It's always good to have the class spokesperson, isn't it? And I assume, although I'm often wrong, that you guys know what party presidents are. So, so far in the presidents we've talked about, well, we haven't really talked about any for this unit, but the last unit, we talked about FDR, then Truman, and then we talked about Eisenhower, and then Kennedy. So I'm just going to ask. So FDR, Democrat or Republican? You can say something or type it in the chat, whatever makes you happy.
Democrat.
Okay. Are we agreeing with Connor? You probably should, by the way. Okay. And then Truman, who was his vice president, that's your clue. So Truman, Democrat or Republican? No, you're going to do, we really have to do this? Nope, Democrat, because if he's FDR's vice president, and thanks for putting it out there, John, because I mean, you know, you're playing along. I appreciate it. So vice president typically is the same party as the president. So since Truman took over for FDR, you know, probably Democrat. I know we have the big exception of Lincoln, but you saw how that went. Nobody's going to do that again. So Truman's a Democrat, and then the guy after Truman is Eisenhower, Republican or Democrat. John's never going to try again. So Eisenhower, Republican or Democrat? I feel like I'm failing as a history teacher here. Okay, if you guys don't answer, I'm just going to log off. I'm out. I'm out if you don't answer. Was Eisenhower a Republican or a Democrat?
Repeat the.
I was doing that while you were talking. Was Eisenhower a Republican or Democrat? And I'm agreeing with the Republican. Yes. Yeah. Okay. And then after Eisenhower was JFK. And then, oh, we talked about LBJ too. Was JFK Republican or Democrat?
Democrat.
Democrat. And then since LBJ was JFK's vice president and JFK was a Democrat, would you expect LBJ to also be a Democrat?
Yes.
Yes, and you would be correct. Yeah. Okay. All right. And in that era, it's kind of tricky, I think, to tell the Democrats from the Republicans because they all do kind of the same thing. The only big exception in that whole group of people in the middle was Truman, because he really pushed for civil rights, and then LBJ because he really pushed for civil rights, which neither party was super excited about. They were mostly excited about scaring the crap out of the Russians and trying to build up defense. And looking for commies, both parties were doing that. So when you get into the more modern era, I think you start to see a little more difference between Democrats and Republicans. And then in the current era, I have no idea, to be honest. Do you see a difference between Democrats and Republicans now? You probably do. Like one probably wants more immigration and one wants less immigration. One wants more social programs and one wants fewer social programs. Maybe you see that, I don't know. All right, during this time period, we're talking 60s, late 60s, early 70s, you start to see a little more of a distinction. And I think Nixon, you've probably heard of him, really exemplifies most of those distinctions. And you're going like, no, Nixon's just Watergate. Okay, but Watergate doesn't help you see the difference between Democrats and Republicans. And if you look at Nixon's actual policies, that will probably help you. Okay, so you got to know what I'm telling you. You have to know more about Nixon than just Watergate. Okay, but knowing about Watergate too. All right, you know anything about Nixon? Tell me something you know about Nixon before I jump in there. You can say Watergate. I don't care. Do you know anything about Nixon?
He was in Forrest Gump.
Oh, gosh. Forrest Gump, always. Okay. Okay, maybe not attractive. Yeah, that probably didn't help him in the Nixon-Kennedy debate. What was he doing in Forrest Gump? Do you remember? You don't have to, by the way. I'm just
Wasn't he the sitting president in Vietnam?
Yeah, he's the last president in Vietnam. Was he running? Nixon's definitely not a jogger. There's a really, you know, the president who jogged more than we wished he did was Bill Clinton. I shouldn't say that because, you know, I'm not a jogger and I'm not in the greatest of shape, but when Bill Clinton was president, he was like chunky Bill Clinton, and we had those 70s jogging shorts, which he still wore. So we saw too much of you when you were jogging back in those days. I'm just saying. But jogging, I don't think was a presidential thing in the 70s. but starts to be a thing with Clinton does it. Reagan's kind of old for jogging, but then, and old Bush doesn't do it, but young Bush does do it. And Barack Obama does it. I'm pretty sure Trump doesn't jog. And I'm hoping Biden doesn't, I'm just saying. All right, I guess we should get back to the business. I think in Forrest Gump, I don't idolize Forrest Gump and probably have seen it 2 or 3 times and not in a decade. I think in Forrest Gump, you see Nixon inviting ping pong players to the White House, maybe, or we go on the ping pong international tour, because that's with China. That's during the Nixon administration. And of course, Watergate. Forrest Gump discovers Watergate in the movie, where the guys break into a hotel. That's Watergate. So neither of those things are exactly true, although they're partly true, because that's the beauty of Forrest Gump, right? Okay, I feel like I've gone over this 1968 thing before, but we'll do it quickly. Nixon is running for president in 1968, which is among the crappiest years in US history, although you're living through another one of the crappiest years in US history. So congratulations. If it makes you feel any better, I've lived through both of the crappiest years in modern US history, I think. But you don't have to agree with my assessment of these years. 68's bad because it's the height of the Vietnam conflict. We've got 2 major assassinations that year, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy. We have riots in pretty much every major US city in the country. We have the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong from North Vietnam take over major cities in South Vietnam over a weekend during the Tet celebration, Tet Vietnamese New Year. Realizing, of course, that within a few months, the Southern UN guided troops are able to get control of those cities again. But it does look as though our country our leadership that has told us we're about to turn the tide, win the war in Vietnam, maybe isn't telling us the truth. Also, LBJ says, I'm not going to run for a second term. The guy who's probably going to win the nomination is Robert Kennedy. He gets assassinated right after he wins the California primary. There's chaos at the Democratic convention, and the police are called in and they beat up protesters and reporters, and it's an enormous mess. The Democrats end up nominating a pro-war candidate, which upsets half the Democrats, the half clearly that were opposed to the war. And then Nixon kind of sweeps in and says, hey, I'm your dude. I will represent the silent majority. He would never say, I'm your dude, by the way. He's a very formal kind of guy. There's weird photos of him walking along the beach and he's in a suit. So if you need to know anything about Nixon, that probably tells you a lot. That's the guy that dresses up in a suit to go for a walk on the beach. He's not fun and relaxed. But Nixon said, you know, I'm the new Nixon. I'm not going to be as confrontational. I'm not going to hold grudges. I will represent the silent majority, not the people who go out and protest and loot and riot, that kind of stuff, but the everyday law-abiding working people, and I will restore law and order. And moderately interesting that you heard a presidential candidate this year say both of those things, that he represented the silent majority and would restore law and order. In 68, this works a little bit better than it worked for President Trump, but it's also because the Democrats were completely divided and the country was in chaos. Now, I am not saying the country isn't in, we're in a little bit of a funk right now for sure, but the political parties are not divided. Now, the 2 parties don't necessarily like each other and they're not getting along and working together, but we don't have like a huge fight within the Democrats and a huge fight within the Republicans. I recognize there are differences between, more moderate and more extreme versions of both of those folks. Nixon wins because he promises to do the things we just said, represent the silent majority, and the lawlessness, rioting, that kind of stuff, restore law and order. But he also says he will end our involvement in Vietnam by shifting the focus of the fighting, planning an exit strategy, and that he will end the conflict with honor. In Vietnam by 1968, we have 500,000 people in country. So at the same time, drafted, serving over there, or volunteered. Disproportionate drafting of people who are poor and people of color, because they don't know people that can kind of get them out of the draft, and they can't afford college, which is your automatic exemption. So people are kind of getting fed up with the drafting policy. That's part of what leads to splits in the Democratic Party. And I've mentioned more than once, this pro-war side, anti-war side, when Robert Kennedy gets killed, creates some lots of issues. LBJ doesn't run again, Nixon wins. There's other stuff going on in 68 that make it a rough year. I've already mentioned the Tet Offensive. I think I've mentioned the My Lai massacre before. Your book mentions it. This is a unit that's stationed outside of, or I don't know, stationed is the right word, positioned outside of the village of My Lai in Vietnam. There's a sniper in the village. The sniper kills people in the evening from this military unit. They go in to find the sniper. They are unable to find the sniper. The village refuses to turn the sniper over if they know where he is. They get frustrated with the people in the village, who at this point, because everybody's been drafted in Vietnam as well. So all the men, or even men, pre-men, like dudes about 12, all the way up to probably 60, are fighting. So all you have left in these villages are really old people and really young people and women in the middle. So they go into the village, they round up all the old people, young people, and women, and ask them where the sniper is. Sorry, there's a bug in my house. And they say they don't know, so they shoot all of the people in the village. Hence the My Lai massacre is what it's typically called. They end up arresting one person. I think his name was Edward Calley. I can't remember. Cawley, yeah. And he ends up being convicted and serving like 3 days in jail for this before he's pardoned. But what ends up happening is they blame this fellow who's a non-commissioned officer, a lower level officer, rather than the people more in charge and who may have, stupid bag, who may have actually been more at fault. So, but that case is a sign of our frustration with the Vietnam conflict and who's guilty of stuff, who's not. By 1968, there are really two camps of people, maybe three, but we'll go with two. The people who think it was a mistake to ever go there, we never should have even gone. And the people who think we should have gone, but we should have let the military people prosecute the war and not the political people make decisions about the war. But both sides were fed up with the war, and both sides were ready for the troops to come home. So Nixon's plan to shift the focus of the fighting, plan an exit strategy, and in the conflict with honor, he will try to follow through on that plan and may or may not have success. One of the shift of the focus of the plan was away from Americanization, which was LBJ's plan of using US troops primarily to fight the war, to Vietnamization. And I know you're asking, is that really a word? Well, it is now, I suppose. Vietnamization, which is Nixon's idea that we should use primarily Vietnamese troops to fight the conflict in Vietnam. So draw down the number of American troops while increasing the number of Vietnamese troops. That is Nixon's new plan. The thought is, it's their war, they should fight it. And also, if they're the ones in country and in the battle, then they will be the ones who get killed. So it'll decrease the US casualties and maybe slowly get people from the US out of the conflict. So Nixon shifted the focus of the fighting, and he's planning an exit strategy, which is going to include US negotiations with North Vietnam. Now, since North Vietnam is winning the war, they really don't have much incentive to negotiate with the United States. So the United States has to create events that cause that incentive. So what they decide to do is to bomb the living daylights out of North Vietnam to force them to come to the bargaining table. And the US will also bomb the countries of Laos and Cambodia, which border Vietnam. The reason they'll do that is the North Vietnamese are using those two countries to transport troops and supplies for their war effort. The UN has said specifically that all combat actions need to be within Vietnam. We are going to violate UN guidelines and bomb supply trains and troop movements that go through Laos and Cambodia. Somebody mentioned in another class that we're doing more than just conventional bombing. They're using something called napalm. And napalm is really designed to clear the foliage. It is foliage, the plants. Napalm is jellied gasoline, and if it drops on something, it catches on fire on contact. So, and the US also used something called Agent Orange pesticide to clear out the jungle foliage, jungle plants, so that it would be easier to see who was hiding, where to send bombs, that kind of thing. And they tended to spray that directly on the soldiers who had been positioned in those jungles. I say this knowing, because some of my uncles, pretty much all of my uncles who fought in Vietnam, have that experience. One of them less so. The one who was in, let's see, what did he do? He was the Air Force one. I had one in the Army, one in the Navy, one in the Air Force. And the Air Force one got less Agent Orange stuff. The other two died of cancer, probably related to Agent Orange, so, which was the pesticide. Vietnamization, did we mention? Yeah, we already mentioned that. So that's sending in the Vietnamese troops. Bombing to get the negotiations, that produced some pushback in the United States. And what's different about Vietnam than previous conflicts is it's all televised. And I don't mean it's on television 24 hours a day, but every day on the major news channels, we would see clips of what was going on in Vietnam. And the more spectacular or sensational those clips were, the more they were watched. So we saw a lot of this. The pushback was student protests on many campuses throughout the United States because they saw bombing civilians as an inappropriate way, to get the other side to the negotiating table. Now, these protests took over certain universities, and the most famous two protests were at Kent State, which is in Ohio, and Jackson State, which is in Mississippi. It's like, Mississippi. So in both these cases, student protesters took over certain parts of the campus, shut down some classes. At Kent State, they took over a building or two and set them on fire, most notably the ROTC building. Now, so some of these protests were, all we were saying is give peace a chance, and they were handing out daisies, and they were hugging people, and they had signs that said make love, not war. In other instances, they're burning down the ROTC building. So this doesn't go over well in the press. In the 60s, which is still a relatively conservative area, in the 70s, which is a relatively conservative era, and the governors of Ohio and Mississippi decide that they will call in the National Guard. And they do. And the National Guard doesn't necessarily handle it perfectly. And they end up shooting into the crowds of protesters, and people get killed. And sometimes they are protesters, sometimes they're just students who are going to class that day, which is where I usually pause and say, if you're going to college in person and there's a protest or riot at the college, which causes the National Guard or even honestly the police to be called in, I think you get a free pass on going to class that day. I wouldn't go if I were you. Stay home. After Kent State and Jackson State happened, certainly there's a lot of discussion of this in the press, but a ceasefire is negotiated in 1972. It seems to me like both of those events, Kent State and Jackson State, happened in 1970. U.S. agrees to withdraw from Vietnam in exchange for return of POWs and a promise not to harm those in Vietnam who cooperated with the U.S. And as you can imagine, neither of those things happened, and you would be correct. All right. Nixon's foreign policy is often referred to as détente, which looks like detente, but it's détente, which really just means negotiation. So instead of threatening to blow the crap out of you, to nuke you into eternity, which is mutually assured destruction or massive retaliation, we decide we'll negotiate with you and maybe find something that you want in exchange for something we want. So that's kind of how this goes. Nixon will see the Cold War more as something that can be managed rather than something that needs to be won. And he is ably assisted by an old guy, he's an old guy now, he wasn't that old then, Henry Kissinger, who's an immigrant from Germany. And he's in charge of national security. Sometimes in the Reagan administration, he's the NSA, National Security Advisor, and sometimes he is the Secretary of State. He is going to arrange negotiations between the United States and certain countries like China and the Soviet Union, and then at other times just between certain countries like Egypt and Israel, the Soviet Union and China, that sort of thing. The reason that he's negotiating, of course, is to bring peace, to bring to bring the different countries together. What's going on in the Middle East during that time period is a lot of kind of traditional warfare. However, the oil reserves and access to those have become more important in the modern era. And that's also why we get involved when Egypt and Israel are fighting. And we want to make sure that's resolved as peacefully as possible. So we will commit to, trying to arrange peace between some traditional enemies like Egypt and Israel that had fought throughout the 60s and 70s, but also like North and South Vietnam, who may have not been traditional enemies, but certainly were in the modern era. And then we're not necessarily fostering goodwill between the Soviet Union and China, because it honestly works in our favor if those two guys are fighting. I know they're not guys, but those two countries are fighting. But we are going to send Nixon to visit both Moscow and China. Moscow, the capital city, and then several different cities in China. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, to try to build trust with the leaders of both of those countries. And two, to try to build distrust between the leaders of both of those countries. So they'll fight with each other, but make deals with us. So that was part of our goal. So we want the communists to distrust each other, but to like us. And we have some success with that. And we developed something called the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. And what we negotiate with those two is to bring an end to certain types of nuclear weapons. Probably the most important thing that comes out of that is the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, which directly limits the production of ICBMs. And I know you're super excited about that, right? Like, dang it, I was tired of us producing those ICBMs. It was time they had to go. Yes, they had to go. Does anybody have any idea what an ICBM is? It's like, I just noticed I put that in there and didn't explain it.
Intercontinental ballistic missile.
Look at you. Connor knows all the stuff. So yeah, intercontinental ballistic missile. And since I know Connor knows this, but just in case the rest of you don't, we had signed disarmament treaties before for a long time. I mean, we signed a whole series of them in the 1920s, 5 and 9 power naval treaties, this sort of thing. And Washington Disarmament Conference, we did a lot of that stuff. But typically, and again, Connor knows this, when we signed disarmament treaties, we agreed to stop producing stuff we never really intended to use. Like all those treaties in the 20s, those were naval treaties, and we agreed to stop building obsolete battleships, like whatever. It'd be like if I told you I would never again drive a Pinto. They don't even make those, and they used to blow up in the 70s. So it's a weird little round car. But when Nixon and the Soviet Union negotiated this treaty, the ICBM was a cutting edge weapon. It was the delivery system for those nuclear weapons. So this was a big deal. I'm trying to tell you this was a big deal. It was very meaningful arms negotiations, because typically we have pretty trivial, okay, missiles dropping nukes from space. Look, we've already talked about this. I'm not very good at the military stuff. These things, I know they're in outer space, but they cross over from you launch them from, you launch them from the ground. You launch them from missile silos, because we don't have planes roaming around, waiting to nuke each other, even in that era. So you launch them from the ground, they go into the atmosphere, and then, because they work better if you don't see them. I know we can see them with radar. It's like, yeah, that's the thing we can see them with. But yeah, it was a big deal. It was a big deal. Yeah. Okay. All right. Kids making fun of me because they think I don't know where the ICBM goes. All right. Nixon is also going to change the way that we deliver federal government services, social programs, things you might consider welfare in the modern era. So those would be things like food assistance, daycare assistance, educational assistance like Head Start and Job Corps, those sorts of things. So while the funding will still be federal, those things will be administered by the state government. Yes, the state government. The theory behind that was the state government had a better idea where the need was, how to administer the need, that sort of thing. And they wouldn't just do the same thing in each state the way that the federal government might do. Plus, if you already have that administration set up at the state level, you don't have to pay to duplicate the service at the federal level, so we can save money. And were we broke during this time period? Yes or no? Are we broke in the 70s?
Yes.
Yes, we are. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to ask a harder follow-up question. And are you guys going to make Connor answer all the questions? Is that how this works?
Yes.
Okay. Good job. Okay. Connor.
Who said that?
Who did say that? I don't know if that was Laura, and I
I have
couldn't.
a right to know my accuser.
Ashton.
Oh, Ashton said
Okay,
it.
I don't know who you are, so.
Oh my. Okay, well then it's perfect that she said it, because you can't really retaliate, which you wouldn't do anyway, I'm sure. However, why are we broke in the 70s? What did we spend all our money on?
Korea and Vietnam.
Okay, Korea and Vietnam. Did we spend on anything else? Those are perfect answers, and you're correct. Do we have any other program going on, say late 60s, before Nixon was president?
Marshall Plan?
Well, no, we did have them. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. But this is a program to end poverty. Do you think ending poverty would be expensive?
Yes.
Yes. Have you guys ever tried to end poverty? You guys got any poor relatives? Do they need a little money or do they need a lot of money? But ending poverty is hard to do. So we have a war on poverty and a war in Vietnam at the exact same time. Don't you remember? Great Society, war on poverty. Oh, what kind of a teacher am I? You don't even know this stuff. So we're trying to end the conflict in Vietnam. We're trying to end poverty, and we're just spending like crazy. So we're broke. It's like you will be right after college. It's like, dang, we're broke, and you want to go out and buy the new car, but you cannot because you have to pay off your student loans. Our student loans were the Great Society and the Vietnam conflict. So, crud, we're broke. So instead of continuing to spend the same amount on these social programs, we wanted to turn them into state block grants. So we just give the money to the state and we tell the state like, hey, you take care of these programs. We're not going to do it. Okay. All right. So we've covered detente. We've covered, oh, did I tell you it was called New Federalism? Did I even tell you, or did I just get excited about asking you questions and how you guys are making Connor do all the work? I feel like I just got excited. So New Federalism is the idea. Do you know what federalism is? God, I make all these assumptions. Are you going to make Connor answer this one? Do you guys know what federalism is? You could type something in the chat. I will never end this class if you don't tell me what federalism is.
We don't know.
Okay, I appreciate you saying that though. Thank you. No,
Isn't it like a system of government?
Yep, it's a system of government. As Abel said, it is something. Although I believe Abel is the same person making fun of me because he doesn't think I know how ICBMs work. He's probably right. I do know how federalism works, Abel. Okay, so here's the thing. That means we have two different levels of government. You have national government and state government, and they share powers, or they have, sometimes they share powers, sometimes they have separate powers. So the federal government, they control stuff like the military and immigration and interstate trade and that kind of stuff. So they make those rules. But the state government, they control things like education and some of these social programs. So New federalism is the idea that you're shifting some of the programs to the state level, but funding them at the federal level. So federalism is sharing power between the federal level of government and the state level of government. Can you think of other things? This will be the last question I ask you for the day, I promise, okay? Can you think of other things that the state controls that the federal government doesn't make rules about? Because the biggest example typically is education. Like most of your education funding for, especially for public school, comes from the state, like 95% of it. Can you think of anything else the state controls? I'm looking in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm slow. Yeah, toll roads, licensing of all kinds of stuff, like how you get your license to cut people's hair, to how you get your driver's license, which I know is, quite important to you guys at your age. You guys don't want a license to cut somebody's hair, probably. How you get licensed to teach in public school, which I have some of those licenses, are how you get licensed to teach in college, which you don't, by the way. You don't even have to have, you just need a degree because they just assume you can do stuff when you teach college. And no one assumes that public school teachers can do stuff, so we got to have all kinds of tests for them. All right, so I'm going to keep going, but not for much longer, because I know you guys are already looking and you know it's almost time to go. The new federalism, sharing power at different levels, and they're giving more responsibility to the states to administer these programs. This makes good sense on one level because people, what we need, social needs, what we want our schools to do in Texas might be different than what we would want them to do in Minnesota or some other state. I have no idea why I picked Minnesota. or the Dakotas, where 5 people live, like 2.5 in each state. So different states are going to do things differently. However, problem with new federalism, my estimation, you don't have to agree, is that the budget cuts were really big. So big part of the reason the federal government does this is they want to save money. So this way they cut the budget. Maybe they were spending $4 billion on this program. They go like, hey, we're going to administer it locally. We don't need as much money for administration. So we will only send them $3 billion. So they get less money to accomplish the same purpose. So some states will start taxing to make up the difference in that funding, and other states will not. And that's also why you get different types of services, social services especially, in some states that you don't get in others. It's also why taxes are higher in some states than they are in others. And I know I said I won't ask you another question, so I won't ask you this really, although I'll ask you, you don't have to answer. Would you expect that, well, you've probably noticed there are certain states where taxes are higher. Those states, like say California, give more social services. That's also why, in the modern era, we see people from those higher tax states where you get more social services moving to lower tax states where you get fewer social services. But then sometimes they come and go like, why don't we get social services? It's like, because we don't tax you for them. Okay. The Nixon administration also created the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which cleaned up the environment and protected it. And we will probably start with that next time in class. Now, your question, weekly questions about Ronald Reagan, I think we'll get there pretty quickly. I know I was a little slow today, but don't give me a hard time. Do I need that from you people? No. Okay, before we go, don't do it yet because I want to double check on the roll. But do you guys have any questions that we need to ask the entire group?
No.
Okay, thank you.